With that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Simon.
Thank you. Good morning, all. Right, my name's Simon Dudley. I'm Life Sciences video evangelist, as Monica's already said. I want to say firstly, thank you, Monica, for inviting me, and thank you, Bob, for getting me involved. So as you can tell, I flew all the way here from Austin, Texas, which is where I live. So I'm sure you can tell. You're not meant to laugh at that. It is actually true. I got a driving license and everything. So I wanted to talk today about a whole bunch of things, and I hope this is a unique presentation. If you've ever had the 4 levels of facts, Police Academy 5, and the future of the healthcare market in the US all combined together, and no talk about video conferencing, which is what I normally talk about, then come and see me afterwards, because I want to see this other presentation. So one of the things I want to talk about first is the 4 levels of facts. I go to presentations all the time, and what presenters do is they add real facts, what I would class as level 1 facts. Level 1 facts are things like the Earth goes around the sun, pi is 3.14, there's 180 degrees in a triangle, that sort of thing. You know, real, actual facts. Then there's level 2 facts, which are basically subjective positions that most people agree on. I would argue those are things called Wikipedia facts. Then there's level 3 facts. Level 3 facts are basically a strongly held opinion that may or may not be true. I class those as a pub fact. And then we have the 4th level of facts, which are purport to be facts but are obviously total lies. You know, we didn't land on the moon, there's chemtrails, the world's run by lizards, you know, that sort of thing. And I treat those as Illuminati facts. And so what I've done for the rest of the presentation is in the bottom right-hand corner of every slide, and I think this should be mandatory in all slide decks, I will put one of these 4 symbols in. So you know if it's an actual fact or an Illuminati fact, and I try to get away from Illuminati facts, but one is in there. So Monica was talking about, in your first presentation 10 years ago, you had a gentleman come along and talk to you about the future of healthcare. And I don't know. I don't use the American healthcare system if I can avoid it. Anything seriously goes wrong with me, I'm back to the UK on the first plane, I'll tell you now. Because at least it's free and they don't present me $1 million bill. But anyway, I don't know. Neil Armstrong said it beautifully. We have no understanding, or we believe the world will change enormously in 1 year, but we don't think the world can change enormously in 10, and in fact it's the other way around. Now, one of the problems is that in the last 10 years, maybe 15, we've developed this new thing called the internet, and we've totally failed to take advantage of it. You see, one of the things we have is, as Wittgenstein, a famous Austrian philosopher, actually, out of interest, when I say famous, hands up, does anyone know who he is? All right, a semi-famous Austrian philosopher, he said, your knowledge tells you what you see, because he was asked one day, he said, one of his students said to him, he said, how come those people in the Middle Ages were so stupid that every day they watched the sun rise in the east and they still thought that the sun went around the earth? And he said, yeah, but what would it have looked like if it had done that? Of course, the point was it would have looked exactly the same. So your existing knowledge already tells you what you're seeing. And the reason I bring that up is because I'd like you all to think, this is after all the Open Minds event, and I'd like you to think about all the things that you do in business that you already know the answer to, because that's the way it's always worked. And it isn't necessarily true. In fact, it's interesting, once you know that the Earth goes around the sun, it's obvious. But it was obvious to all those people in the Middle Ages that the sun went around the Earth. Here's the other fundamental problem you all have. Who sees Elvis in that picture? Or a smiley face? Or someone winking at you? They're not real. What your brain does is it automatically fills in the idea of seeing faces, because we have built into our psyche a positive reinforcement system about seeing things. We always see patterns. You can never not see a pattern. There is nothing you've probably ever looked at that you cannot understand. Your brain will make a decision for you as to what it's seeing, whether it's real or not. And again, that's something to consider when you're thinking about your business, or your organization, or whatever it is you're doing. Because sometimes there isn't patterns, but sometimes there is. That is, in fact, a power switch. And that one is semicolon minus sign close bracket. It is not a smiley face. And that is a cloud, although it might be Elvis. It's a famous one, by the way. If you do faces in clouds, there's a Google search, there's 1 trillion of them, but I've decided just to put Elvis up. Because Elvis makes an appearance later in his presentation. So one of the things to be aware of is that, as William Gibson said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, and I will give you a demonstration of that later today. So if the internet is so great, why hasn't all of our lives changed? And I want to give you a sense of scale here. Everyone thinks, oh, the internet's just got a bit bigger recently. We've got a bit more compute than we used to have. Well, actually, since about the year 2000, on average, the amount of compute power available to everyone and the amount of storage available to everyone has gone up by about 1,000 times. So it's a big deal. It's changed a lot, but are we really using it? So I'm in the next couple of minutes going to spend some time talking about this. Whether 1,000 times is really that impressive, whether the internet has ruined our lives, how great war is. Perhaps we've just simply not had enough time for all this technology to take effect, and why we need to stop putting donkeys on freeways. So 1,000 times is not that impressive. Well, to give you a sense, here's two of the memory cards, right? 10 years apart. They've gone up by 1,000 times. Well, one's got M on it and one's got G on it. I mean, what difference does it make? You know what, to your average consumer, they're like, yeah, whatever, the new one. I remember buying my first 2 gig USB key. Amazing. Now I don't use USB keys at all, but you can buy 128 gig ones, which would just be mad. Think about losing that much data. But anyway, your brain can't think of 1,000 times. So the height difference between, say, the Washington Monument, which I suspect most of you saw as you flew or drove in today, is the same, is 1,000 times bigger than this remote control. That is 555 feet high. This is about 6 inches long. Another example of 1,000 times, this is about 500 people in this room. The population of Albany, New York, or of Fresno, California, is 1,000 times bigger than this room. And that would need a very much larger PA system. So 1,000 times is a big deal, but we can't really think about it. So the internet has ruined our lives. The number of people who now do little rap videos about how, well, you're always looking at your iPhone and you're never interacting with people and all this nonsense is telling you that everyone's looking at social media and Facebook and Twitter and Candy Crush and all these other things, and that their lives have been ruined. It's funny that you have to go onto the internet to find out that your life's been ruined by the internet. Maybe you just get off the internet. Anyway, no, don't get off the internet. It's great. You know what? And it's not true. I noticed, I used to catch the tube to work when I lived in London a few years ago now, and before everyone had an iPhone, everyone had a newspaper. And it was much better because I didn't even need to look at their face then. So people have been ignoring each other forever. So don't worry about it. And let's also be honest, we've done great. We have done great. The quality of our lives is immeasurably superior to pretty much anyone in history. To give you a sense of how well we're doing, if you want to be one of the 1% folks complaining at Wall Street, if you want to be in the global 1%, you have to earn $34,000 a year. If you want to be in the global 0.1%, you have to earn $70,000 a year. So we're living in an insanely rich time, and the internet doesn't seem to have ruined everybody's lives. They seem to be doing good things with it. And if anyone needs any credits for Candy Crush, see me afterwards. So maybe we haven't had time for these effects to take effect. It's possible. After all, 10 years isn't very long. Well, let me give you some examples. We went from Sputnik, which was really just a very simple radio transmitter in a 2.5 foot across ball that went in a low Earth orbit for a couple of days, to landing Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong on the moon in 12 years. Can we say we've done the equivalent of that in the internet? I would argue not. Here's another example. The Lancaster bomber and the Vulcan bomber, two of Britain's, in this particular case, greatest aircraft ever made. 11 years separated their launch dates. Their first flights were 11 years apart. We haven't done that much with the internet yet, I would argue. So war is great. Bit of a controversial statement in front of a medical fraternity. Hey, it's good for business, one could argue, but realistically, it does obviously have major downsides, and I'm not suggesting war is great, but I would suggest that it has some advantages. Because ultimately, it's the ultimate necessity is the mother of invention. So, everything is a compromise. Every technology, everything you do is a compromise. One of the things that the necessity gives you is that you throw cost out the window. You don't care about that. You will do whatever it takes to stay ahead of your competition. Now, if you're to look at the cost of the last 5 generations of strike fighters that the US has owned, from a P-51 Mustang all the way to a F-22 Raptor, the price has gone mad. This is in 2013 dollars. By the way, a P-51 Mustang costs $600,000. An F-22 costs $375 million. The Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, looks like it's going to cost $700 million each. A general in the US Air Force said recently that by 2050, at current rates, the US Air Force will have 1 aeroplane. We're all paying for it. It'll be $1 trillion aeroplane, probably. Well, the reality is that we don't think that's going to happen, partly because the cost has become absurd, and partly because there's actually been a total revolution in aircraft. The F-22 is probably the last manned fighter ever made of that level, and we'll probably go to drones, and drones are much, much cheaper. But it does indicate that the problem with the 11 years from Sputnik to, or 12 years from Sputnik to Apollo 11, or from the Lancaster bomber to a Vulcan, is that this price goes through the roof. Has anyone else seen a massive spike in any of the industries they're involved in that goes up and to the right? Would that be healthcare, for example? So we need to change the way that we do this, because otherwise by 2050 we'll have 1 patient. And it'll be Bill Gates, and he'll leave the hospital with a frightening bill. Excuse the pun there. So let's talk about the change between the 20th century and the 21st century. The 20th century was very much a trickle-down experience, right? Technology came at the very highest levels. It came out of the Second World War for things like compute, things like Bletchley Park, and the nuclear program, the Manhattan program. And then it trickled down. We started with enormous computers. We moved down to mini computers. We went to PCs. We went to iPhones. Our life ended with Candy Crush, right? It started rare, and it was actually considered valuable because it was rare, right? The American Air Force would be very concerned if anyone's building an F-22 equivalent today. They don't. What they do is try and overwhelm the US Air Force with much more stuff. That's the Chinese and the Russian philosophy. They win by sheer weight of numbers. But as a 20th century solution, particularly for the West, and America specifically, it was very much a rarity as a valuable commodity. So you have a mindset that says we start with something enormously expensive, a $10 million MRI scanner as an example, and then we work out how to move down. The 21st century is going to be very different, and it's going to be very different for a number of reasons. There's going to be a bubble up type environment. So in other words, because of the growth of the middle classes, and I don't mean in America, because according to every politician in this country, there either isn't a middle class or they're killing it. I'm not certain which it is. But in the rest of the world, the middle class is getting much wealthier. Now, they're not getting as wealthy as Americans. To give you a sense, only 3% of India's population is richer than America's bottom 1%. And you think how poor America's bottom 1% is. But that top 3% is all considered middle class. And so those people are not going to be looking for the $100 million or $100 or $10 million or even the $1 million solution. They're going to be looking for the $20 solution to a problem. And the governments in places like China, where they have an enormous middle class, much bigger than America's already, they are going to be looking for much cheaper solutions because they can't do what we do and just throw lots of money at it. It's a different scenario. So they will start tiny and build up. And the internet gives those people an entirely new way of working. Because what the internet does for our century is to do what mains electricity, the national grid, the ubiquity of electricity did for the 20th century. See, in the 19th century, you built your factory right next to a power station, and you built your power station right next to a coal seam, or maybe a water supply. Where what happened in the 20th century is that the factory moved away from its power supply, and then the office moved away from the factory. And what's going to happen this century is that people are going to use compute power in the same way that electricity was used. In other words, it's just a utility. It's available to all. And because people will be developing solutions in the $10, $20, $30 each range, they know that they can reach billions of people, and therefore it becomes an addressable market. This gives you a sense of what the world economy is going to look like. By 2050, over half the world's population will be middle class. Interesting, I know a lot of people complain about capitalism, and it does have its downsides, but it's pulled more people out of poverty than anything else in history. And what's interesting is that the share of Europeans and Americans, particularly, by the way, Americans, that are the middle class is going to shrink dramatically. And as a result, the solutions that are going to bubble up from China and India are going to be very useful here. I think we'll benefit greatly. So let's talk about donkeys on the freeway. I mean by that what we've done is we've taken a technology of the 20th century and we've basically stuck it on the internet. And we haven't thought differently about how people do business. And I think that is a fundamental problem. We're using old tools, or we're using new tools, but we're using them in the same way that we used to. I feel that we're taking slide rules and using them as hammers. It's just, or calculators as hammers. It's not the right solution. We need to think differently. The problem is, you're already programmed to think in a different way. So here's my Illuminati fact. An old friend of mine, Ian Carter, told me this once. He said, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always had. You know, it isn't true. It isn't true at all. People think, oh, well, I'll just continue to do the same old thing. I'm retiring in 35 years. The world won't have changed in that period of time. It'll be fine. No, it won't. What you do today, if you don't change it, you'll be overtaken by others, and the technology will sweep you away. So if you're not constantly in motion, you're going to be in trouble. I just fancied putting that slide in, really. So let's talk about John Gorrie and Frederick Tudor. Does anyone here, other than Monica, who I know does anyone here know anything about the ice trade from Boston in the 1850s? Great. It was, by the way, in 1900, the 9th biggest industry in America. So these two gentlemen, this guy here, John Gorrie, he was a doctor in Florida in the 1850s, and he invented refrigeration, and he did it because he understood that his patients, if kept in cool rooms, didn't get malaria. Of course, they didn't get malaria because they didn't get bitten by mosquitoes because they were in cool rooms. But he didn't know that. His knowledge told him what he was looking at. But anyway, he invented refrigeration in 1854. This chap, Frederick Tudor, he decided to take blocks of ice, break up blocks of ice in reservoirs and lakes in Boston, and put it on boats and ship it, and I'm not kidding you here, ship it to Savannah and New Orleans and sell it to people because they would like ice. The trouble was, when he got to Savannah and New Orleans, no one knew what to do with it. No one had seen ice before. So he got on the dock, not surprisingly. 92% of it had melted on the way, by the way. And then he got it there, and then they didn't know what to do with it. So they thought, well, we'll store it where we store all the other stuff that needs to be preserved, in the salt house. So 45 minutes later, all of his ice had melted, and they had a lot of salty water. So who do you think won? Well, for the next 60 years, Frederick Tudor won. This became an enormous business, the 9th biggest industry in America. There's a whole bunch of patents surrounding it about how to cut up ice. If anyone's seen the film Frozen, the main character in the film, or the guy in the film, is actually an ice harvester. And effectively, it became an enormous industry. And Frederick Tudor was asked in the 1880s, are you worried about refrigeration, or how this being replaced? And he looked and said, well, how can anything be colder than ice? So no, of course you can't make ice anywhere, even though the patent existed already and had done for 30 years by John Gorrie. By the way, the ice didn't just go to Savannah and New Orleans, it went everywhere. There was a shop in London in the Strand where they used to put a block of ice. It was so clear that they used to hang a newspaper behind it, and people would come to the window, gawk at it, as if London doesn't know what ice is, but apparently it was a wonder of the age. And they would stare through the newspaper and read through 3 feet of ice, the Times of London through the other side. The ice went to Calcutta, it went to Australia, it went to Japan. It was an amazing thing of the age, even though refrigeration already existed. So you think, well, why is Gorrie such an idiot that he didn't get it working? Well, partly because Frederick Tudor tied him up in court for the next 30 years and broke the man. And partly because what John Gorrie didn't have was a useful power source. He didn't have electricity. Now, by 1900 or so, electricity was becoming relatively available, and as a result, refrigeration took off. It was well after his death, by the way. And now the whole idea, no one here, however many folk are in the room, no one even knew that it existed, and it was the 9th biggest industry in America. So poor old John Gorrie invented a technology that no one used. So think about how, in your organizations, how there's already technologies that are latent within the business and latent out there, that future is already here, and think about how that might be used. Another extreme example, Leonardo da Vinci, they've built his helicopters. All he needed was an internal combustion engine. He would have flown 500 years ago. Of course, building an internal combustion engine is pretty hard. So to be fair to Leonardo da Vinci, it was typical of him that he had a genius idea but no way of actually realizing it. A more relatively modern example would be CDs, right? CDs came out in 1982. And people said, oh, it was replaced by the iPod. But it wasn't, It was replaced by the iPod plus all these other technologies. If Apple had produced an iPod in 1990, it wouldn't have sold because it needs all these other things. It needs the internet. It needs an MP3 file format. It needs hard disks that are relatively small, don't need mains power, and aren't the size of a washing machine. And all these other technologies needed to come together to make this stuff work. Now, one of the advantages of the internet is that because all these ideas, all this software, all these things out there are already there, working out how to plug multiple things together should be relatively easier than it's ever been before. The other example is Kodak. Kodak was an interesting organization, and they're the poster child for an organization that failed to understand the new market. But the funny thing is that actually it's pretty disingenuous. I would argue, I feel rather sorry for Kodak, because they did in fact invent the world's first digital image sensor back in 1976. And you go, well, why didn't they get in the digital camera business? Because what Kodak didn't do is make high-speed processors. They didn't build the internet. They didn't build hard disks. They didn't understand the JPEG file format, and they didn't build color printers. And without all of those things, then your digital camera is pretty useless. After all, if you're ever going to take a photograph with your digital camera, and the only thing you can ever do is show it on the back of the screen of the camera, it's pretty useless. You need to show it on Facebook, show how fantastic your life is. You do it too then. Okay. So here's the problem you've all got. Right? If the technology does start changing, and I'm sure many of you feel that it does, the technology cycle is now shorter than the product life of the product. It never used to be true. You used to be able to buy a new MRI scanner or telephony system or records environment, and you go, well, that'll last 10 years and we'll pay it off over 3 and we'll be fine, and we'll probably end up keeping it 20. But now the rate of change has become so great that you've ended up in a scenario where people don't know what to do, because you sit there and go, right, this thing will take 2 years to roll out throughout my organization, so let's really make that 3.5. Oh, and the technology's out of date in 18 months. It's the laser disc problem. Anyone want to buy a laser disc solution? And of course not. And you don't want to be the guy or the girl or the person, I've covered everyone there. Oh yeah, and how you go to a conference and people say, how's your new technology? Well, the laser discs are going great. No one wants to be doing that. So what do you do about it? Well, the first thing to be aware of is that it might be a better idea to buy it, to rent it rather than buy it. Now, I'm not worried about it. I don't have any preference one way or the other. It's not a sales pitch from me. But if you rent it and you don't like it, you can always give it back. There's an old phrase that says, if it flies and floats, rent it by the hour. There's more to that, but we'll leave it. I promise I wouldn't put that in. Filthy people. Right. So maybe renting's a better answer. Remember, there is no one answer. I remember 25 years ago when I first got involved in technology, there was a lot of people who would turn around to you and say, Novell NetWare 2.08a. Anyone remember that? See me in the bar at 10. Oh, that'll take over the world. And then Microsoft LAN server will take over the world. And then WordPerfect has taken over the world and is unassailable. And then Office will take over the world. And there has always been this nirvana that we are rushing towards. It's the ever-receding bonanza. So don't think that whatever you're looking to install or put together or run is going to be the right answer, because it isn't. Because what happens is, what success looks like changes over time. It's annoying, isn't it? You'd like to think that, well, I just get the right thing, we'll put the version 10, that'll definitely work, and then I can go home and just wait for the money to roll in. It doesn't work that way. And you also need to look for additive solutions, right? 2 + 2 has got to be more than 4. Adding multiple technologies together can produce better results than individual ones. But the other thing to be aware of is that one of the things that people do have a nasty habit of extrapolating to infinity. I found this on the internet. Apparently by 2045, everyone in this room and everyone on the planet will be an Elvis impersonator. Now, I don't know if that's true. I put pub fact. I was going to put Illuminati, but I can't prove it wrong. So I decided I'd go with pub fact for that one. It might be true, but it probably won't. So don't worry too much about this sense of, oh, well, the world's going to be better, faster, it's going to go all off in this one direction, and Microsoft or Cisco or whoever is going to run and win it all. They're not. So I'd probably work on the principle of hedge your solutions, and don't be an Elvis impersonator. It's really weird. Now, one of the other reasons, things that people never ask me, but I thought I'd answer this question anyway, is why does Police Academy 5 exist? I'm sure it's a burning question in all of your minds. It is if you watched it. Why does this exist? Is normally the first question you ask. Anyway, Police Academy 5, why does it exist? It exists because, as Mr. Mayer of MGM, right at the beginning of the film industry, said in 1927, no one knows what works. So the reason you see so many sequels, or prequels, or pre-sequels, or whatever they call them these days, is because people will make a reasonably hedged bet that the thing that did 100 million before will probably do 80 million for the second version. So I'm guessing, and I never spoke to anyone about Police Academy 5, it's one of those dark secrets one never discusses. But I suspect what they did was they go, right, we'll get all these no names, no one there is famous, infamous perhaps, but not famous. So they work out, right, we can build that for $10 million, that product, and we know that we'll make 20 million because someone will be drunk enough to say, oh yeah, I quite like Police Academy, watch 5 instead. And they will make a few dollars out of it. So one of the things I would recommend people don't do though in our world, in the technology world, is don't do the, well that's worked in the past, we'll just reinvent the same thing from the past. We have to think differently. This is the ultimate donkey on the freeway. Now one of the things that's a problem is Luddites. Does anyone know who the original Luddites were? Okay, the original Luddites, you guys don't get out much, or get out too much perhaps, and don't read any books. But anyway, the Luddites were a group of people who at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England, in the late 18th century, so about 1780 to about 1810, when the power looms came to England at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, these people were cloth makers, they were home weavers, they did stuff with cloth. They actually earned pretty good money. Clothing at the time was enormously expensive. Most people had one outfit, which would make the walk-in wardrobe at my house easier to manage. And it was very expensive stuff. What the power looms did was revolutionize that industry. It put an enormous amount of people out of work from a skilled point of view and made them into factory workers on pitiful money. And these people were so incensed by this, they would go to the factories and burn them down. And that isn't a small matter. That isn't a slap on the wrist, bit of tear gas, go home. This is, best case, you're transported to Australia. Worst case is they hang you, and most of them they hanged. So the Luddites in the 18th century had a major beef, and I can understand why. Another lovely example of Luddites would be musicians in cinemas in the 1920s. When the talkies came out, they all were upset because these orchestras, and some of the cinemas had orchestras of 115 people, were all out of work. And one of their posters, I love this one, it says, is art to have a tyrant. They were so upset that films had sound now that they all went on strike, which was ridiculous because it just meant everyone in the cinemas replaced their equipment with sound equipment because they didn't have an orchestra, so it speeded up the process. And from now in history, we can look back all this distance and go, well, they're stupid. They're King Canute. They're working against the tide, right? They're never going to hold this back. But in our modern world, we all do it. It's like, oh yeah, but the trouble with creative destruction is the destruction bit. Yeah, you're right. It is. But you know what? And I don't know what all these people will be doing. And my 12 and 13-year-olds, it concerns me because I don't know what job they'll be doing in 15 years, 10 years from now. But the reality is that we've always built more new interesting things than we've smashed old ones. And so as a result, I think we need to be less worried about it. But the last one I found was black cabs in London complaining about Uber. I actually think they've got less of a problem than DC or New York cabs, because DC and New York cabs don't actually know New York or DC, where London cabs actually do know London, and it's complicated, where Uber drivers won't know it. But there's an example of the Luddites. So if you've got an organisation that's Luddite-ish, it's a problem, but you're going to have to deal with it. And you can't sit there and say, right, well, we just won't do anything, because that'll get everybody out of work. So let's talk about healthcare, and let's talk about where we are, what our problems are, what's holding up healthcare. Well, I would argue that, and I'm no physician, but I've noticed, I don't think there's a lot of genetic difference between people living in Texas, well, not maybe Texas, but say Rhode Island and Virginia. And so why do we have a healthcare system that means physicians can't work between states? That's kind of mad. That needs to change. I think the idea of an FDA where if you have one person has an adverse effect to a drug out of 100,000 trying it, and that means that drug can never be used, I think we've become too risk averse in much of the medical processes that we do. The greater good has to be more beneficial than individual rights. And then I think that this top-down approach is going to change. I think the enormously expensive and then we bring down the cost over the next 30 years issue is not going to solve the problem. So what's going to transform healthcare? Well, I put Fitbits up there because I happen to be wearing one. I walked 1,000 steps in the last however long I've been up here. I haven't got a clock. So I'm getting mine in. You people are all sitting. How many people here have got a Fitbit or its equivalent? That's great. Actually, that's a much higher percentage than normal. And I think that this constant telemetry, as this technology gets better, I think will be very useful. Today, it's bizarre that in most cases, individuals know more about their own health than their doctors do, because these things aren't integrated into their healthcare plans. That patently needs to change. I have high blood pressure every time they measure my blood pressure. Apparently it's called white coat syndrome. I do, I can feel it. It all goes red at the edges of my vision. I think things like video conferencing, which is obviously my normal day-to-day job, and I'll happily talk to you about it after this presentation, I think that will transform video conferencing. It already is. If you want some real-life examples, talk to Bob Kyler and others here about how video conferencing is changing the way that particularly mental health is being delivered. And then I think that this enormous growth in the middle class on a global basis will allow us to have a trickle up, a bubble up from below effect. So conclusions. Bottom-up approach is definitely coming. The future is already here, you just need to find it. John Gorrie or his equivalent is out there today. The status quo is a failing strategy, and look for solutions that add to existing ones rather than live as separate things.
I hope you'll join me in thanking Simon.